We're now going to start with the second half of our program. And again, we're happy to welcome up onto the stage Dr. Yelina to moderate the next panel, which will be looking at the topic of emerging trends, contemporary art and architecture in Arab countries, and their role in global design trends.
Thank you, Marrakesh. Hello again. We tried not to double appearances, but I'm stepping in for my colleague Fahad Al-Obeidli, who couldn't be here today. So I'm an impromptu moderator for this panel, and I hope you bear with me. But I'm hoping that our speakers will speak instead. And it's a very exciting topic because there is a lot to be said. It's also interesting because it very much fits within the context of Design Doha, which is celebrating regional excellence. So I would like to start by asking you to, each of you, to introduce yourself to the audience, and then we will talk a little bit more about the topic itself. Would you like to start, Bsma?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Bsma, and I am one of the partners of Anbuku, which is a creative and cultural consultancy. If I were to describe myself, I would say I'm an interdisciplinary cultural practitioner who has been in love with stories since I was a kid. So I've been obsessed with creating opportunities and platforms for others to tell their stories, and have been part of like the publishing world, events, management, and also design strategy with Bnaan, who's one of the partners.
I'm Bnaan Ya'qoubi. Again, as Bsma mentioned, I'm a partner in Anbuku, but I also have a background in branding. Very passionate about elevating the role of design. I think Bsma and myself are both very passionate storytellers, but I'm also extremely passionate about how visual communication can actually play a very important role in how you can visually narrate a lot of the stories. And I work both in branding and also in creative cultural consultancy.
Hi everyone, I'm Jاسm السداح, creative director of Babylon Design Studio, an architectural office based in Kuwait. So we deal with architecture, interior, and branding. And we're very interested in definitely, as the girls mentioned, storytelling within our architecture, and of course creating a very totalitarian design, be it going from commercial to residential to public buildings.
I'm curious to learn a little bit about your education and how you got where you are now. What inspired you to go into these creative professions? Shall we start with you, Bsma?
Yeah, sure. I think I have the sort of a bit of a weirder background than everybody else, but I have a traditional background in sciences, so I am an immunologist as well as a public health policy specialist. But I actually went into the creative field because I had a passion for stories since I was a really young kid, and I attribute it to my mother and my grandfather, who are both published authors. So I think when I look back to my history and my career progression, I always look at how I was involved in creating platforms for other people to tell their stories. So my why was actually helping others tell their stories as well. So I've been dabbling in this industry for quite a while, and it's been a really fun journey so far.
So with myself, growing up, my father was actually a manuscript collector. He used to collect Arabic manuscripts, and I was always very fascinated by the way they do the layouts and how they'd actually do all of that by hand. So I grew up appreciating that a lot, and I just always loved and knew that I wanted to do this. I was actually very adamant about the fact that I want to study graphic design from a very young age. I did grow up in a family of traders as well, so I was always kind of also brainwashed that I have to enter the family business, which I did actually for 10 years. But during that time, I also opened up QB, which was my agency, because I was actually really passionate about that, and then eventually exited to focus 100% on that only.
So I initially studied architecture in Kuwait University for 3 years and a half, and then I was not really feeling that I was getting the education that I wanted. So I applied for different universities in the States and in the UK, and I went with the choice that I really wanted to go for because I was very fascinated with the architecture that Zaha Hadid was doing. So I went to the school that she actually studied in, so the Architectural Association in London. Stayed there for about 7 years, took 2 years, gap years out, worked in London and studied obviously in London. And then after that, in 2008, when I graduated, it was the economic recession, where I was really keen on getting more experience in the field in London, but unfortunately, I couldn't find a job there. So I went back home, which I think was to my advantage. And then a year later, I started off with my office, Bab Design Studio. And the whole idea was based on the name itself. So Bab is door, and Nimnim in Kuwaiti, I think usually it comes from the Farsi word, which means half and half, which is a small thing or a small trinket detailing. So I was interested in the whole aspect of the door being the threshold between the architecture from the outside and the interior from the inside, so creating a complete vision. In that sense, so hence the name, and went into starting small projects, commercial projects, up to now doing public buildings, which we recently finished a mosque in Kuwait.
So if I'm correct in estimating this, you all studied both in your countries in the Gulf as well as abroad, right?
Yes.
And you all came back. Tell me a little bit about what's your perception of doing architecture, doing design, or any other creative activity while you were abroad versus while you're at home? How do you practice architecture? Is there any difference between what you did in London and what you do in Kuwait?
I think for me, especially, like for instance, when I first came back, there was this huge influence in the sense that I really was interested in certain words or certain, the Kuwaiti dialect is, let's say, regional, let's say, but there are some certain words or certain proverbs that I was like really interested in. So initially I started off with the whole idea of looking into, of course, my language, which is Arabic, because I had a very English upbringing. Went into an English school all my life and studied abroad after for my profession. So looking at that aspect where when I came back home, I had this almost like a person from the outside, looking at my culture, understanding it, and trying to find, I found it very fun in that sense. So we started off with this, looking at different proverbs, and I created these T-shirts initially when I was very young, these T-shirts that explain the different hand gestures of the Kuwaiti dialect. And then from there on, I started to look at, for instance, I did Dar Hamad, which is a big project that I started off early in my career, which was a project celebrating our culinary food in Kuwait, which for me was very important, looking at the different proverbs, and then I applied them into the plateware, let's say, even the way how the menu is done. So it was a complete project from the outside. The whole project is the idea of the Sanduq Mbayat, let's say, which is the dowry box that's given to the bride. When it's definitely from all of the region, Bil Khalij, but the whole idea is from the outside is the Sanduq Mbayat, and then when you go inside, it like celebrates different design eras of Kuwait, which was like the golden era of Kuwait, which is the 50s, 60s, up to the 70s. So there are definitely different mid-century influences within the interior. And then going into that aspect of when I first initially started as, looking at these different proverbs and words, and then applying them into the plates and into the menus and into the branding, I think was a very nice thing for me to celebrate, let's say.
Did you always have this interest in the traditional crafts and other kinds of aspects of cultural heritage? Or did this interest increase when you came back from London to Kuwait?
It definitely increased when I came back to Kuwait, in the sense that, let's say, during my studies in architecture school, we first initially started with the whole drawing by hand and doing everything by hand. And then everything in the middle of my studies started going digital. So like the whole aspect of having this connection between your brain and your hand, of doing something on the piece of paper, was transformed into the digital, so it became very detached, let's say. And then when I went back home, looking at definitely the words or the culture, and looking at the architecture itself, and re-establishing it and interpreting it into something new and modernized, I think that was the turning point for me. And that's pretty much it in that sense.
Right. How was it for you? Did you have similar experience of going somewhere, experiencing something new, and then coming back, but seeing your own culture with different eyes, or your interest being increased by being outside and coming back?
Yeah, sure. So with me, my story maybe is a little bit different because I actually started studying. I look younger than my age, don't judge, but I started studying in Beirut when I first started graphic design, but then the war broke out in Beirut and I moved to the US. So this was in 2006. And I was someone who was extremely passionate about typography, or the idea of actually looking into the evolution of calligraphy and how calligraphy and typography are two totally different things. But sometimes when you speak to many people, they'd have a misconception about both. So when I went to the US, I was actually not too excited about the fact that I had to actually switch, because I was extremely happy where I was in Beirut and where I had reached with regards to my career with Arabic typography and all of that. But then when I went to the US, it was a totally different approach with studying. And it was like, I got both from the East and the West. And what was amazing there was the networking and actually the platforms and how you could actually be part of that whole ecosystem, which I would say back in the days was a very raw market here in this region. But now it's amazing to see that this is evolving. So I think it's great that the younger generation or the younger designers have an ecosystem that's I would say very favorable, and it's amazing, and actually allowing them to foster these relationships. So when I came back, for me it was really about bringing back, because another part of my story was also that when I wanted to study design, a lot of people were like, what's design? Why design? Like, you graduated with top honors, you need to be a doctor or you need to be an engineer, and there was that struggle. And also the fact that when I wanted to go abroad, why do you want to go abroad? Because I want to do design, and there wasn't a school that I was, convinced with here or locally in the region. So
but do you feel that has changed in the meantime? That this perception that it's a valid occupation?
I think now it has changed a lot, because for me, I believe that it's not only the school, it's also the faculty that makes a difference. Like, you need to, and growing up as someone who was passionate about design, I didn't really have a lot of role models from the region in my mind as designers, A lot of the people I used to read books for were always, I would say, foreign designers, But I think now this has changed a lot, and I think this is very important, because even our voice in design and how we're approaching design is rooted in who we are. And I think that this is the best time to actually be a designer in this region.
And you also mentioned that the young designers in Saudi are supported, very well supported.
Very well supported.
Is it better to be a young designer in Saudi than in the States these days?
Definitely. I think you have much more opportunities. So I think actually now there's a fight on good designers. Like, they get headhunted, Like, if you're good, you're taken. Not just in Saudi, I think in the region. Everywhere. If you're good, there's high demand. And then you also see the culture now of, should I be part of an agency, or should I be a freelancer? Or there's that struggle as well, because every designer wants to do their own thing or their own voice, because there's a lot happening if you're a designer. And
is it for all designers, or is it mainly for graphic designers that situation is so good?
I think for all dezigers.
All.
I think for all designers.
No, so I think a little bit differently from both is that my creative practice only started when I went back home. So when I went back home, as I mentioned, I started in publishing. So as you guys can tell from like the media, they're not very favorable towards the GCC or the region in general, and that used to really aggravate me, and I wanted to shed light towards the storytelling and actually shedding light on like the talent that we have, because mashallah we have like a really good pool of creatives in across the Middle East, and why weren't their stories being told? And we used to joke around that a lot of people used to tell me when we started first Saudi Design Week and then Saudi Design Festival, it's like, what is Saudi design? Isn't even such a thing? And I'm like, why would you even ask that kind of question? Because our history is so rich. There's so much that you can really explore, and looking at that. So my endeavor of like really fighting the fight for designers or on behalf of designers and creating that platform to allow them to shine on their own has been a really fulfilling journey. But it only started when I went back home.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the GCC and different countries, do you feel that development of design, appreciation of design, education are developing in parallel and that there are many similarities, or do you feel that it's a very uneven situation between countries? How does it seem to you? Are these developments sort of across?
From my experience, if I'm going to look at Kuwait, let's say, so in our profession for architecture, so there's a school of architecture in Kuwait University. It was established back in 1997, and I was part of it. This definitely outlook of always looking towards the West, and I think it's still kind of there. I think they need to also just go back into like looking for local architects and local architecture. There has been a movement towards it. There was a book that was published by the NCCAL, I think, about 5 years ago, which focuses on the modern movement of architecture that happened in the 50s and 60s up to the 70s, which I think is interesting, going back into looking at the architecture of Kuwait in particular, because it was very prominent within that time frame. And of course, correct me if I'm wrong, you see this also happening over here in Qatar, where they're like looking into their older buildings, they're renovating them, they're giving them a second life, and of course the same happening in Saudi Arabia, which I think is also a very good thing. But with educational institutions, I think they need to find some sort of a middle ground where they definitely, of course, get the experience or get the information or get the syllabuses or whatever it may be from the West, and also reflecting back on what has already been done within the region. And then in that sense, I think it gives a better understanding and appreciation for the students while they're studying in their studies, and how they could definitely look into these buildings instead of demolishing them, because we live in a very consumerist global society where it's like, oh, out with the old, in with the new. So I think that mindset needs to change.
Mm-hmm.
I think across the GCC you'll see this huge push towards educational platforms, and I don't think we need to look at it from a super traditional point of view, but everything from scholarships to pushing towards the creative industry and the creative economy has been pushed towards across all the countries in the GCC. And I think we also have to give credit to initiatives and institutions such as Design Doha, such as Saudi Design Festival, such as Dir'iyya Binale, and different initiatives across the GCC where they actually allow for, let's say, untraditional educational opportunities and cross-collaboration, which is, I think, even more important than a traditional education, and that's not necessarily that even if you have a design background or if you don't, to allow you to collaborate and to allow you for opportunities to network. And I think in its own right is education.
Yeah, and I think to add to what Basma is saying, I think cultural research is always something that's very big and very important, and we see that growing a lot in the region, which is amazing, because usually a lot of people sometimes when it comes to research, they avoid it, or because sometimes even if it requires a lot of funds, it's not necessarily something that will commercialize very quickly. But then, for example, in Doha, it's the first time I see Msherib, for example, and I was fascinated. And every day I walk out of the hotel and I look at all the details, and I just admire every single detail that you see. And then when we were talking to some friends and we were trying to understand the depth of the project, we got to know that it was actually a whole research project, I believe, if I understood right, that was done under Qatar Foundation for a very long time. So it shows. You can tell from the outcome that this is something that was truly researched with a lot of depth. So I think this is the importance of how a lot of this research that's happening can eventually materialize into something that would actually be an international benchmark that international entities would actually learn from, you know? So it's great to see.
And actually also building on that, I think preservation is also very important, and also educating younger people into the skill sets of craftsmanship. I think that's also very important because with educational systems that are put in place now, it's always based on very textbook, very old mindset of how educational syllabuses are done. So if there could be some sort of a focus on building a skill set for somebody who's young into, like, let's say carpentry, or let's say weaving or brass making and all of that, I think
the
it should be.
education in the crafts, in traditional crafts, is still missing.
Yes, I think it's still missing, and there is an outlook towards it, and there's an application towards it. Like, for instance, there's Earthy Council in United Arab Emirates, I think so, صح ولا بالسعودية؟ إرثي في الإمارات. So I think their focus is very nice, where they're applying that, which is focusing on the craftsmanship, and also Beit al-Sadu, which is in Kuwait. So I think these institutions need to have a focus on the younger generation.
I think they also do have a challenge, though, of making sure that the younger generation want to.
Exactly.
I think the economics of that is very important as well. So elevating the actual profile of traditional craftsmanship to actually make a living, and that will help you bring in the next generation.
And I think that's also interconnects very well with the idea of research, because I think the idea of research and also the depth of the backgrounds of all of these crafts, and making them understand that you could think of it from an innovative approach. So something that could be a traditional could become the next innovation that you are taking to a new level. I think that's the kind of mindset that
and integrating technology, because we can't ignore technology happening in AI and everything that's happening, and integrating it into crafts. And I think a lot of people look at it as a taboo subject, but you can't rely on technology 100%, because then you will lose the character and the actual story. But having some sort of in between is a nice mix.
I think it gives it the narrative, right?
Yeah.
So that it's
a new one.
I'm curious, we talked in the previous panel about this interplay between tradition and innovation, or global and local. Do you feel that interest in things local right now is because there is a lot of backlash against globalization, and generally people, not in one country but in pretty much everywhere, young people being interested in tradition, in sense of identity, trying to reclaim that uniqueness through traditional crafts, through that basically the interest is there because of this general moment of this paradigm we live in that is now a big questioning of globalizing trends? Or is it something else? Is it something particular to this region that does not happen in other places? There is an interest.
I think it's a bit of both. It's a tricky question, I would say. But we always look at it that we're local with the global outlook. So you have to come at it with a local mindset, right? Because we live in a world that's interconnected. So you can't escape the fact that there is globalization to a certain extent. But I think what's interesting right now is that we are more proud of our heritage and our background, and the push towards actually identifying that and being recognized for that is more of an interesting storyline right now than it used to be. Yeah. And I think, Bernaan, you had a very interesting example about the Cartier collection that we visited recently.
So we were talking about this earlier, and I was mentioning that actually 2 weeks ago I was at the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, and I visited the Cartier exhibition, and I was fascinated to see that it was all about the influence of Islamic art on their jewelry pieces. And I was fascinated to see that there was an entire collection, actually multiple collections, that were inspired from the domes of mosques and the actual structure of how these mosques were actually made. And it's something you don't really know or see if you just go to Cartier, even if you wear Cartier. But unless you dig into that and you dig into the history and you read and you actually put effort to go to see exhibitions like this, you'd get to see that. So even though historically we influenced a lot of things, probably whether it's in art design or architecture or whatever, it wasn't really celebrated. But I think now things are changing. And I believe that a big part of that is because there's a lot even happening in the region. So there's a lot of focus on this region. So I think it also gives you that opportunity to have, I think, a louder voice and a story that could start from here and extend internationally rather than the other way around. So I think it might actually shift, where we might see like what's happening here influence international practices. And we were actually discussing this earlier with our friends from Shepherd Architects, and how even with, for example, innovations that you see in Sherab, for example, how they worked with the shades, how they worked with the cooling systems in Doha when they did the stadiums. All of these technologies or all of these innovations were basically thought of because when the World Cup actually happened here, and it was in a country that needed that kind of solution because of the weather, they innovated something totally new with the cooling system. So that is now something that will come out of Doha and go to the world, because we know that eventually, and we see it with the heat waves that are happening in Europe and other places, that they might need these kind of solutions. So again, I think it's turning around. So now a lot of the innovations coming from this region will go, and I think Basma, you can add on that with the projects in Saudi as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at all the giga projects that are coming out from the region, especially in Saudi Arabia, you have, of course, NEOM and the Line and a lot of different initiatives. But actually, if you look at the mentality, and I think it's entire different school of thought where they actually broke how architecture usually works. They actually brought in all the star architects and made them work together in a collaborative manner to actually come up with solutions that weren't thought of. And for me, honestly, that was inspiring to see how much work went into this and how much the world can actually start learning from what they're implementing in their giga projects as well.
And not only that, I think also with architecture, looking at the Mashrabiya, like let's say for instance, so with the Mashrabiya, you could see it being used in a lot of modern architecture now. So it really goes back to the Islamic and Arabic architecture. The interesting fact about Mashrabiya is the original name of it is Mashrafiya, where people or the women inside the house, they would actually yushrifun ala nas, so they would actually look at the people from inside the house, and they cannot be seen from the outside. And Mashrabiya is the bottom part of the Mashrabiya, where they would put the clay pots for the water and they would drink from it. So that now is transformed into the word of Mashrabiya. So from that, you could see it, applied into definitely the architecture that you see here in Sherab, the architecture that's been done everywhere in the world, where it definitely applies a secondary layer to the glass facades and adds some shade and all of that. So in that sense, I think it's becoming interesting, where we used to see architecture from Islamic era go into the West, like let's say. Earlier we discussed about the whole aspect of how Islamic architecture influenced Neo-Gothic and even Gothic architecture with the lancet arches. And now we're seeing it going back into the architecture that we're doing now, and with the arches and the traditional aspects or the traditional ratios of architecture being reused into something that is much more minimalistic, or reinterpreted into something that's much more minimalistic and cleaner lines, let's say.
Bnaan gave excellent examples of things coming now from the east and moving to the west, in the opposite direction. And in architecture, what do you see as something that can serve as a model for others coming out of this region?
Well, I think
heard about
definitely
stadia,
yes,
and cooling systems.
Exactly.
Is there anything else that you would?
Well, now with what Bsma mentioned with NEOM, it's setting standards with this crazy amount of architects collaborating with each other, star architects especially, and also with the crazy amount of projects that are happening within the region. I mean, obviously, I think OMA, Rem Koolhaas, did this book that was called Al-Manakh, which was, I think, 10 years ago, or even more, 15 years ago, which focused on the whole aspect of, how we're trying to rebrand ourselves. And, this is a global thing that's happening around the world, where different regions, different cities are trying to brand themselves as this exciting city that's happening and or whatnot, in the sense of its urban planning and the sense of creating this utopia, let's say. So that was back, let's say, 15 years ago. And now we're seeing it transform into these very sleek, clean-lined projects, which we don't know the scale of its grandiosity, So it's interesting to see it happening now within our region. And there are living examples that are happening, like, for instance, in Sharib, definitely now different projects that are happening in Saudi Arabia, the standard would also happen back in the day with the UAE, with Dubai, 20 years ago, it was not as congested as it is now with the architecture and the skyline of it today. So it's interesting to see how it's coming back towards us, and how, let's say, Dubai, they name it the Manhattan of the Arabs.
From flashy to something more substantial.
Exactly,
I like how
exactly.
you said about research, that at the bottom of all of this is research, and to bring back the conversation to education.
And I think to add to your point is that a lot of times, even when you're talking about the West, a lot of their impressions about this part of the world is formulated, if they haven't visited, I would say, by something they read or something they heard or something. But when they actually come, or they actually have the chance to experience our values, to experience our culture, I think this also changes a lot in the perspective of how things develop, whether it's in design language, whether it's in the thought process, whether it's in the research. And I think there is this thing where I see this a lot, or I hear this a lot, where they say, it's local or international or regional. I think the beauty of the time that we're in now is the idea of cross-collaboration. Definitely there's someone who's better than me, maybe, I don't know, in the UK or in France or whatever, in a certain thing or a certain profession. And
But do you think people here collaborate more than they do in other places?
I think this is the beauty of what we're seeing now, is that specifically because of the nature of the projects that are coming up, they're very big projects. So for you to succeed, you have to collaborate. Or at least I know, for example, in Boku, this is the way we work. It's always about bringing a consortium together of the best experts in the specific project that we're working on. We believe that we cannot do something on our own. So I think that's the beauty of it, because whether you have someone from Japan with someone from the UK and then someone from the region, there's that also, transfer of knowledge. And that's how you would eventually also grow the younger generation to make sure that they grow up to actually, acquire new skills and learn new things. And I think this is also the beauty of a lot of the design residencies you see happening in Doha, you see happening in Saudi, because I think these residencies open up this opportunity, right, to actually exchange knowledge as well. So.
And to have an understanding, and also
to
own the narrative
to
that
own
we
the
have,
narrative,
because we never really owned our narrative, I think. So now is the time where we're owning our narrative, and we're expressing it as much as we can.
I don't want to be biased. I'm from the region, but I think that if someone experiences our hospitality and experiences being with us, you can't write this in a book.
No.
It's intangible. You have to feel it to understand it.
Yeah.
What you're also saying is that there is certain level of cultural confidence that, because of everything that has been done, because of the emphasis on the creative fields, because of the research and education, there is a sense of competency and confidence that it instills in people. And this is what pushes these projects forward.
And I think also, honestly, the beauty of what we're seeing in our region is that there's this belief in us as talent and putting us on the table with big people in the industry and they're asked to collaborate with us. So I think this is the beauty of, that if you actually do that, a lot will change in how the narrative is unfolding. Because you also need to be culturally relevant, right? So if you bring someone from abroad and he doesn't understand anything, even if he's the best at what he does, if he doesn't understand, then he's not going to be applicable, you know?
Exactly.
And not only that, I think it's also because we're designing for the people that are within our countries. So we can't really have an outsider's perspective of whatever's being designed for us, really, at the end of the day. We're the end user. An example of that earlier, also, I was talking about it with the girls, was, for instance, I think maybe 15 also years ago or 10 years ago, Karl Lagerfeld did a clothing line collection. I don't know if it was for Karl Lagerfeld or for Chanel, where he used Quranic verses on the whole...
Sorry, I didn't catch the name of the...
Karl Lagerfeld.
Lagerfeld.
Yeah, Lagerfeld. He did a complete collection of clothes that had Quranic verses on the dresses, and he had a huge backlash, you know? Like, why not consult with somebody who is Arabic or Muslim, you know, at the time, just to make sure before, you know, doing that collection. And then after that, I think 2 days later, they like burnt all of the collection, you know? So in that sense, I think it's very important for us to own our narrative and also, you know, express it in the way that we want to express it. And of course, definitely we are open for cross-collaboration and having this understanding between us and whoever else who wants to, you know, collaborate within the projects that we want to do. And then just, you know, having that base for that, really.
That's what
I think they said it all, really. But I think, you'll see a lot, I think, even regionally now, that there's the co-commission and cross-collaboration, even regionally, across institutions, which is very admirable. And I think there is a difference between, you know, the importance is that culture in particular has a lot of intangible qualities that you will never really uncover completely unless you really understand the culture. And I think we also understood that even when we were researching Al-Ula. I mean, we're from Saudi, but researching Al-Ula, which has a really diverse background and rich heritage, there are certain things, part of the culture, that you will only know if somebody tells you the story of somebody's grandma telling the story of. So these kind of tidbits are really important gemstones in terms of research and documentation for the next generation to really take forward.
Thank you so much. I believe we're out of time, so I'll have to thank you. This has been a fascinating panel, and it worked. So thank you very much to our panelists, and we will take the